So we left off in the last video where we had a drink object which had an ID property with our random hash, followed by a name property with a string value of lemonade, and we also had a price with a value of 99. Now in this video what we want to cover is properties, methods and values. Now in the last video where we introduced objects, we were talking about key value pairs where we have a key and a value. Now you can use the word key interchangeably. This is also a property. You can see here we have a property, but it can also be described as a key value pairs just to make things more quick and easy. Now the one thing that we haven't discussed yet is how a method can work, or what a method really is. Now interestingly, we have this document up here and we have a function on it called getElementById. Now if you see we hover over it, we have the word method. So when there's a function, and we could even have the function down here, so we could have get the drink details, and then we could say we want to return the drink, and we will look at this.name and we'll wrap it in parentheses and then interpolate a value inside, and we'll do this.price. So here we have what we call a function. If we wanted to attach this function to this drink, we could do this in a few ways. Now, because we have the ability to use hoisting, we could go ahead and just add our get drink details directly to this object. However, we can have the ability to also declare this function as part of the object as well. So instead of using this function keyword, we can essentially take this whole thing and just drop it straight onto the object. Now, this is a new syntax introduced in ECMAScript 2015. The old way, if you want to call it that, was we declare a property called getTheDrinkDetails, and much like above where we have this colon separator, we would then attach a function as the value. Now this became long and tiresome, and we decided it was in fact a great idea just to make it a bit sweeter syntax, and we shorten things nowadays. We can also use arrow functions if we'd like, so if you wanted to, you could keep this as a nice one-liner like this, and we could go ahead underneath and say console log drink. So you can see here this prints out the object as well as the function that we bound to it as well. Now an interesting observation, if we call our getDrinkDetails method, we actually are using an arrow function. So what we're going to use is this.name, this.price, and we're using an arrow function to declare that we want to do that. Now when we save, this is going to cause a lot of errors. Now we can see cannot read the property name of undefined. So that means that this object is completely undefined. Now it's undefined because it's not actually pointing to the object like we would try and expect it to, because remember, this keyword is driven from the item which calls the function. So in this case, our drink is calling this function, therefore this should point to the drink. Now, this is the case, and it should be the case, but the golden rule here is we're using an arrow function, and an arrow function has no this keyword. It simply tries and essentially uses the one outside of the scope. So it's essentially the same as us saying console log this, which again, as we know, is going to give us undefined because we are using JavaScript's strict mode. So in this case, even though we can use an arrow function, it's probably not a great idea as it can cause problems like we've just seen. When we save things out, you can see here that we have drink lemonade and then followed by the price. So these are called properties. If it's a function that we attach, it's called a method. And there's not really any limitations that our functions can have compared to when we are using them on their own, such as underneath here if we would use the function keyword. So there's no difference in behavior from how functions behave. We can bind a function to an object should we wish. So while we're here, we want to just demonstrate some further concepts so you can see how also we can create properties on an object. Now, so far we've covered using strings. Now, these are technically strings. So what the JavaScript parser will almost essentially do is something like this and convert them all to some kind of readable string. And this is the way that they are stored in JavaScript. But we also have the option, for example, if we wanted to create a more complex key. So let's assume we want the key to be perhaps ABC with a space and then 1, 2, 3. If we tried to add a colon and we can say I am the value, if we hit save, all of this is going to go wrong because you can see this is not valid syntax. So what happens if we wanted to perhaps use a space? We might be given some kind of key from another API perhaps, but we want to store it as an object key. All we need to do is just simply wrap it in a string and we can hit save and everything works as intended. Now, the interesting piece is when we want to go and access that particular key. We can't use the dot notation of ABC, and you can see when I select it, it automatically puts it in square brackets for us. We also have the ability to store numbers. So for instance, we'll use the number 100 and we can say I am a number. Similarly, we would do something like this. We could use a string of 100. As we know, JavaScript will change any actual number such as 100 to a string and then perform the lookup. So you can see here that we can either specify an actual number, and you can see I can use a number or a string, and either way it still gives me the same result. And again, we can flick back and it gives us the exact same result. Now again, my advice would be to just stick with one approach. My approach when dealing with numbers is to stick with numbers. There's no point in wrapping them in strings and making things more prone to error. So what we've done so far is learn how to create an object. We've looked at what keys and values are and properties and methods. We know that functions behave in the same way unless we're using an arrow function because it has no this keyword, no this value. It does not bind a this value. It tries and inherits it from the next scope up, which we learned about in the last chapter in function scope and closures. Now, apart from this, we have all the other obvious ways that we can go ahead and access properties on our drink. We can access the ID, we can access the name, we can access the price, and for demonstration, we can log all of these out. So it's up to you how you want to access these. You can access one at a time, you can access the entire object, and we've learned that we can use numbers or more complex strings, and our objects can also have methods on. Now, there's also one interesting thing as well. If we want to perhaps grab our ID value, we can access this from a variable. So we could say const the ID equals string ID, and because this string here and this string here match, we could actually use square brackets and pass in the variable dynamically from up here. So I'll save this out and you can see that we have access it in exactly the same way. Now, just to avoid confusion, we could say my ID and then pass in my ID so they don't look exactly the same. So if you want to dynamically look up an object's property, you can do so via our square bracket lookup. If you need to access a number or a string, square brackets is the way to go. Otherwise, we're going to stick with our typical dot notation.